Hey everybody, I'm Razib here, and I am here in conversation number 43 with Mr. Josiah Neely, and we have a very special guest, Jane Psmith of the Psmith Substack, where they,
Smith. He is
what, it's
silent.
just a Smith? Okay, whatever.
P is silent, like pseudonym.
P.G. Woodhouse.
Oh, I always say the P in my head. That's weird.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. It makes sense. Okay, so yeah, so the Smiths, so Jane and can I say your husband?
John.
He's John.
John. Okay, yeah, John, your husband. You guys review books and whatnot, just kind of comment on the passing scene. And you are well, you are pseudonymous, but actually, like, your stuff gets shared around by some pretty prominent people, so it's not like obscure at this point. It's a prominent pseudonym or semi-prominent maybe, and so that's one reason you're here. And so Josiah, why don't you just take it away in terms of like shepherding the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first, welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, you've done a lot of reviews. I think the Substack has been going for, I don't know, 3 years, maybe something like that. But there were a couple of recent or semi-recent ones that I wanted to talk about. And they both. So these books are Road Belong Congo, which has to do with the cargo cults in Papua New Guinea, and then also I thought we could talk about a review that you did last year, Six Societies, which also involves some of it involves New Guinea, although I guess there's other places, maybe in South America or Africa or whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of Inuit in that book,
Yeah.
too.
Yes, right. Um, so, and I think they're related to each other in some ways, even though they have different subject matters. So, maybe let's start with the cargo cult one, and I don't want you to necessarily give a book review, but most of our listeners, if they're familiar with the cargo cults, they're probably familiar with them from that Feynman essay. But to take the style of every liberal podcast, the history is a little bit more complicated than that. So, what? Well, what's the deal with the cargo cults?
Right. So the image that we have of these cargo cults is basically of people the cargo cults phenomenon, mostly of the southern Pacific of Polynesia, and especially New Guinea, where, white people showed up with ships full of all kinds of cool stuff like, canned food and weapons, tools and weapons made out of steel and guns and, woven cloth. And, it was on their ships, it was cargo. And everybody who lived there said, wow, this is amazing. We're living in the Neolithic. We make everything out of stone. And we, farm pigs. And, I would love to have some Spam. Thank you. And so they really desperately wanted to have cargo. And so this phenomenon starts popping up of these basically religious movements that, purport to give you the secret to get this stuff. And so our picture of it is of people sort of like building like decoy airstrips or like trying to, build like a copy of a European port with the idea being that it's going to somehow attract airplanes or ships, the way that, you do a duck decoy if you're going hunting, or, you plant milkweed if you want monarch butterflies to come to your yard. And so cargo cult has come to be basically a term that we use to mean doing something that looks like the thing that the successful people are doing in the hopes that you will also have success. And that's a real phenomenon. People really do copy whatever seems to be working. There's a reason every tech startup office looks like Google. But that's not actually what was happening with the cargo cults. It wasn't that they thought that if they built a port or built an airstrip, they would, airplanes would just show up. They were building airships because they thought the airplanes were coming, but they thought the airplanes were coming because they were doing religious rituals. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around because the idea that you think that the airships are attracting airplanes kind of makes sense from our perspective. I mean, it's silly and it's wrong, but it's the kind of thing that you could understand someone thinking. The idea that you would do a special dance and then airplanes would show up just seems totally bizarre. So the cargo cults were a big problem for the colonial authorities in these places because they were very anti-authoritarian. They taught people to disobey the authorities. They also encouraged people not to participate in all of these sort of economic development activity that would have allowed them to actually build their own canning factories and things like that. So this book that I read and wrote about is by an Australian, well, British, but then he moved to Australia anthropologist named Peter Lawrence, and he showed up in New Guinea in the 1950s with the idea that he was going to go and do ethnographic research in this province on the northeastern coast of Papua New Guinea. And so he's there and he's, talking to people about, oh, great, like, what do you call your mother's sister? Is that different than what you call your father's sister? And when you get married, whose house do you move? All the stuff that ethnography does. And he's been there for like 3 months, maybe. And somebody says, okay, can you help us clear an airstrip? He said, well, why do you want an airstrip? He says, well, for the airplanes to land. What airplanes? And so, well, the airplanes that are going to send cargo, right? We've got our own white man now, so clearly cargo is going to be showing up, and we need a place for the airplanes to land. And he's totally confused. He starts asking him more questions, and he realizes really quickly that what he had seen as this, bizarre antinomian cult activity actually made total sense from the epistemological assumptions of the people he was dealing with. And so he wrote this book basically to explain, number one, why people participated, why people have these cargo beliefs, and what they actually meant in practice, and to look at the career of the guy who became kind of the New Guinea cargo messiah, which was the whole second half of the book, is about this one guy who, incidentally, is the guy who, so your listeners have probably read, I know you guys have read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is this book from the 90s. I read it when I was a teenager, and it sets out to explain basically why Europe ended up colonizing everywhere, as opposed to New Guinea colonizing everywhere. But Jared Diamond frames it as a response to this guy he met on the beach in New Guinea, who asked him essentially this question. And what he doesn't mention is that the guy had been about 20 years ago the New Guinea cargo cult messiah, who came to a sorry end to the point that he was wandering on the beach talking to American ornithologists. But so the road belong cargo is half a look at cargo cults in New Guinea up to about 1950, and then half the story of this guy, Yali, who Jared Diamond wrote a book to.
Yeah, this is evidence for one of my crank theories, which is, you might be familiar with Dunbar's number, which is normally interpreted as that people can only keep track of a certain number of people for social relationships. It's like 150 or something. But my theory is that actually there are only 150 people. It just kind of it seems like there are more, but actually, if you scale down to it, which is why you might think a little, well, how could Jared Diamond just like randomly be walking on a beach in New Guinea and run into this Yali guy? And it's because
Wait. You're saying 2% of humanity is right here, right now.
I mean, I'm a lawyer, so math is not my strong suit. But if you say so, receive, yes, 2% of humanity could be, on this podcast. But anyway, so yeah, Yali. Okay, so I have another digression. Sorry, this is kind of the way this show works sometimes. But when you're talking about like the not the real cargo cults, but the false impression that we have of cargo cults is like kind of they're doing silly imitation or whatever. It reminded me of another book that you reviewed that also has some stuff in at least Australia. I don't know if there's any stuff in New Guinea, probably a little. The uh, Joe Henrich's Secret of Our Success, right? Um, which talks about cultural evolution. And there it seems like imitation is actually, it's pretty important. You got to like try and follow all the steps, even if they don't necessarily seem relevant, right? So maybe I don't necessarily know where I'm going with that, except that
Well,
maybe
so, I mean, I think what you're getting at here is that, like, we can laugh at cargo cult behavior, but cargo cult behavior, like, the root of it is fundamentally functional, because what you do is you see people succeed doing certain things, and you try to imitate the salient features of what they're doing to get those things. Now, sometimes you can't do it right, and, Americans do it all the time. Like, I don't know if you guys would say that this is cargo cult behavior. I think it is. About like 10, 15 years ago, as you remember, there was a study. Studies showed that the more books there were in a house,
right.
the more the smarter the kid was. Like, the more they read. And there's kind of a tenuous causal connection, really, but like people were literally buying books with bookcases and just like putting them around the house because they thought that would like give some vibes.
Yeah.
To me, that's cargo cult like behavior.
Right. And so I think that is very understandable, but I think what Jane is saying and what this book is saying is actually that's not really what the cargo cults were about. It was something actually much stranger to us.
Okay. Yeah. So I want to put a pin in what you were saying about Joe Henrich's book, because I also wrote a review of that one, and I think it's really, really interesting. But I think the other book review that you mentioned, Six Societies, I think is a very useful and interesting corrective to some of the way that Henrich describes cultural evolution. So I'd love to come back to that. But let me just very quickly say what now I've said, that what cargo cults aren't, so what cargo cults are in this New Guinean context. Kind of depends on some worldview stuff that seems very weird to us, which is essentially that they believed, or at least the people in this particular part of New Guinea, because New Guinea is incredibly culturally diverse, but this particular region, they thought that material culture was created and given to them by the gods. That stuff, right? Not like literally your canoe, but the knowledge of making a canoe was not a product of human invention, but was basically the process of doing it was created by the gods, and it required ritual behavior as part of it. You can't just do the canoe. You have to do the canoe prayers, right? You can't just plant your garden. You have to say the prayers to the tarot goddess. And, if your neighbor has a better tarot garden, it's probably because he's got a better goddess with better rituals. And you could go learn his rituals, and then you can do them, and then you'll have a better garden too. So the entire understanding of how the world works is built around the presence of gods and spirits who are real and physically present in the world around you. Right? They live in like that stump over there, or this grove of trees, or this spring. And if you do the right rituals, they will give you stuff. Either they'll teach you how to do something, or, they'll make your pigs happy and healthy. So when Europeans show up with cargo, obviously they have a cargo god who has, created things like ships that can cross the ocean, and canned food, and guns, and obviously, they know the rituals and the ways of invoking the cargo god. So eventually the people of New Guinea said, or the people of Madang province of New Guinea said, gosh, we want this stuff too. We need to learn their rituals. Gosh, how lucky they've sent us missionaries who are going to teach us their rituals. And they all became Christian because God created cargo. right, God created bags of rice and steel tools and matches, and he sent them to the Europeans. They had this whole reinterpretation of the story of Genesis around cargo where, people were very wicked. And so God sent a flood, but it's okay because he taught Noah how to build a European style ship, and then he gave cargo to Noah's family, except for Ham, who got exiled to New Guinea on account of looking at his father naked. So God took away his cargo and sent him to New Guinea, but then he felt sorry for the New Guineans, so he decided to send missionaries to teach them how to perform the appropriate rituals so that he could send them cargo again, and cargo. The main port that served New Guinea is in Sydney, Australia. So obviously the cargo comes from Sydney. And you can see the boats that are coming from Sydney with the cargo in them. So since God is sending the cargo, obviously God is also in Sydney, but he's in a special place called heaven, which the missionaries have told us about. And heaven is in the sky. So everybody basically concludes God lives in the sky above Sydney, Australia. And he makes cargo, and he sends it down a ladder, and it's put on boats and shipped to New Guinea. And if we do the right rituals, right, if we get baptized and sing hymns and stuff, then God will write our names on the boxes that are coming in the holds of these ships and send them to us. And then we'll have cool stuff too. And so, New Guinea, even now, is mostly Christian. But, after 10 or 15 years of this, they kind of realized that it wasn't working and the cargo wasn't showing up, at which point stuff started to get a little bit weird.
Yeah, this is I think a fascinating element of it is that it's not a static process, because you would think, okay, if they think the rituals deliver the cargo and then the cargo doesn't show up, wouldn't they figure out something was going on? I guess the answer is yes, they do. They keep the nature of the doctrine keeps evolving, but not necessarily evolving in a direction closer to what we would think of as reality, right? They just
Well, right. I mean, this is the part that I found so fascinating is that, it seems really weird, right? We're sitting here going well, obviously, if you do a special dance like that, does not cause canned meat to appear. But if you try and flip it on its head and imagine that aliens have showed up and they, wave their arms around and incredibly hyper advanced technology, materializes out of the air. And they can, use it to, generate infinite energy or, transport you to Peru or whatever. And, you ask them, Mr. Alien, how does this work? And he says, well, it's magic. We're doing magic. You're not going to be oh, okay, I guess magic works. You're going to be okay, well, maybe it's nanotechnology. And the arm waving is some kind of activation signal. Maybe they're emitting signals that we can't measure, right? Maybe they're lying. You're not going to suddenly throw everything that you believe about, the way the world works or the basic laws of physics out the window. You're going to try and analyze what they're doing from your own epistemological framework. And, which makes perfect sense because your epistemological framework is correct. The laws of physics are, in fact, how the world works, we think. But for the Guineans, right, the thing that they understand about fundamentally how the world works is that, material products are created by a ritual relationship between gods and people. And it takes just an absolutely enormous amount of being repeatedly forced to re-examine these very, very fundamental assumptions to break out of it, which is, now you go to New Guinea and you say okay, where does stuff come from? And he's it comes from a factory where they make it, they build it. But even in 1970, when Jared Diamond is meeting this guy on the beach, he's still not completely convinced. Yali, had seen factories. had seen factories during World War II. And, he was aware that these things were not being literally produced by God in heaven. But he was still 100% convinced that the knowledge of how to do it right, the designs for the factory, were a product of a ritual relationship. So at least to me, the most interesting part of this story, aside from the fact that, cargo is just a funny word, and the idea that God is sending you spam from heaven is pretty funny, is just how alien people can be to one another and how difficult it is to have real kind of cross-cultural communication. Because, all the time you've got these missionaries saying, well, if you do the things that God wants you to do, he's going to bless you. And of course they meant, a very Christian understanding of what blessing means. And everybody in New Guinea said, oh, cool, yeah, he's going to send us cargo. That's what blessing means. In the cultural context, there's actually there's no way of communicating what these European missionaries meant by blessing in New Guinea Pidgin English that doesn't have an implication of material exchange, because that was so fundamental to basically any kind of social interaction between people. So it's just a really wild case study of, alien first contact, except that both parties are human beings.
I want to jump in here really quickly. The way you're saying that, it's interesting to me because, and Papua New Guinea is, I think, I'm gonna double check. I think it's more Christian than considerably more Christian proportionally than the United States now. So this is,
I think that's right.
yeah, because it's it has a huge number of Lutherans, for example. So it's 95.5% Christian. The United States right now is, I think, it's 80% Christian, something like that. It's dropped considerably in the last generation, and I think Papua New Guinea has it's 18% Lutheran. It's one of the most Lutheran countries in the world. That's the German. There's a German part in the north. So the way you're describing, and the way Jared Diamond described it to some extent is, Christianity, is associated with these people. With the technology, with the wealth, they have all this, just advanced stuff that these people want. But if you look at the conversion of Northern Europe in particular, certain regions of Northern Europe, especially in Germanic Europe and Slavic Europe, there are records of some of the rationales that people made. And, one of the explicit rationales that new converts would make to the reluctant, traditionalists would be look, um, like look at what the Christians have, God will bless us if we convert to the religion, we do their rituals, and and you guys know the story of I don't know if it's totally true, but metaphorically it's true of Kievan Rus, where part of the conversion of Kievan Rus, which is a cultural progenitor of Russia, to Orthodoxy, was some of them had been to Constantinople. They had seen Hagia Sophia. They saw the city, and they were we want to be like this. This is, we don't want to we want to still continue to drink alcohol. That was part of the story. That's why they didn't become Muslim, but the same story can be told of African groups or whatever that become Muslim as well. You become integrated into this. I'm going to use the word higher civilization. I understand that that's whatever, problematic now, but I think we all know what that means. A lot of people, they see another culture that they admire or want to emulate in certain ways, and they think that's and you can be more rational about it, more analytical, but there are Chinese, for example, who argue for the conversion of China to Christianity because they think the Christian religion, aside from being true, but they also think there are implications from the soul and individualism that will allow China to become liberal, democratic, and wealthy and advanced in a way that the West is, right? Now, that's a very analytical way to state it, but it's not totally different from some of the more folk rationalizations, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of two ways that Christianity, well, just to talk about New Guinea, there's sort of two ways that it was appealing, right? They wanted to make friends with the Europeans, Someone powerful and influential with all kinds of cool stuff shows up like you want to. You want to get on their good side. There's also political reasons that you would want to sort of align yourself with your new colonial overlord, right? You want respect. You want to be integrated into the society. So I think a lot of those reasons are, fairly universal especially for mass conversions. I mean, maybe not for the very, very early church, because that was not a top-down kind of a thing. But once there's a powerful, influential, impressive Christian society, people want this specific sort of like ritual for material gain, not in the sense that like God is going to bless us and like things will look good for us generally, but the extremely like practical, specific stuff that they were expecting. I think it's relatively unusual. Like people definitely expect, new converts often, I think, expect, things to go well, right? You suddenly, you write the Cairo on your shield. You expect you're going to win your battle. But, typically that doesn't literally mean that you're thinking God's going to, send you. I don't know, were they still using a pilum and a gladius by the Milvian Bridge? Probably not. But, he doesn't literally think God's gonna, send you cool guns, which a lot of the New Guineans, when the Japanese occupied New Guinea during the Second World War, a lot of the cargo cultists thought they had been sent by the cargo deity to bring guns that they could use to overthrow that by this point it was the Australian New Guinea. Was a German colony, and then after World War I, Australia, except for the brief Japanese occupation. But no, I was also thinking of the Kievan Rus in Constantinople, because, there's to a certain degree, right? By their fruits, you will know them, right? If somebody's doing something that seems to be really working, maybe you do want to copy that, or try and figure out what aspect of it is succeeding, and keep going with it.
The interesting thing to me, or one of the many interesting things, to the extent that I can understand, that I can put myself in the like mindset or grok the thinking of these people, and I'm always a little wary, like particularly because the nature of the story is misunderstanding. I don't know that I can really get it. Even earlier when you were saying, well, now they understand that cargo doesn't come from the gods, it comes from factories or whatever. I had a kind of twinge of like, is it possible that they're like, oh yeah, it's factories, but the factories are like divine. I don't know. But we think of like, I guess the difference in mindset is that we have kind of like a rationalistic, materialistic type of mindset, whereas the people in these societies are much, like they believe in spirits and so on and so forth. And that's certainly true. But there's also a sense where the problem is that they are kind of too materialistic. And what I mean by that is, even like they recognize all these spirits and deities and other things, but they don't really treat them any differently than we would like an airplane or gravity, right? Or anything like that, right? They're comprehensible forces that you kind of like deal with, or like a boss, a landlord. We don't think of a landlord as a divine being or anything, but it's someone who can influence your life and possibly be placated, and you have to work around and deal with, and for material considerations. And it kind of, the sense that I got is that for the native people of New Guinea, that they believed that like the wind was a spirit, or like there were spirits all around, but they were no different. You don't relate to them any differently, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's more or less, yeah, it's often. I mean, it's a very common, pre-Christian Western way of looking at things too. It's more or less exactly the understanding that the classical Greeks and Romans had of their relationship with the gods. The line for that kind of religion is Latin term "duit des," I give so that you may give. Religious ritual is almost like a legal contract. If you're a Roman and you're doing, you're at the temple and you're doing the ritual and you mess up, right? You say the wrong word or you step in the wrong place, you have to start all the way over at the beginning because there's none of this like ethical content that we tend to ascribe to religion these days. I think largely due to Christian influence. It's not about, how you feel about anything. It's not about how the gods feel about you. You're doing something for them so that they're going to do something for you. They're just these powers that exist in the world. And, it feels more like something out of a fantasy novel to us than it does like religion because we have been so sort of deeply imbued in kind of the Abrahamic understanding of what religion is and what religion means. But I think, historically speaking, if not like in terms of, population, like we're the weird ones, right? Like most people, all caps weird too, if you want to put it that way. But, most people for most of human history have thought of, to the degree that we know, obviously, because most people are not writing things down, have thought of the gods as, more or less like Lovecraftian horrors that can be kind of used to your own personal advantage. Or maybe they are like fond of you, or, maybe it's your like great, 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 great grandfather or whatever. But it's not a question of like their fondness for you or their, general like desire for you to behave in a way. It's like good for you. All of these taboos aren't about, there being something wrong with putting your feet there or eating cooked food or, wearing the wrong color. It's just like this weird, arbitrary rule that goes along with this God or the spirit, and you have to follow it because that's what they said. And then they're going to give you some kind of a benefit. It's a very different, and I think to us, a weird and kind of foreign understanding of the supernatural.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is just transactional, right? It's
Yes,
transactional.
yeah, that's the word I'm
Yeah,
looking
yeah, yeah.
for.
It's very transactional. It's like you're doing a ritual. The ritual is turning a key. The key opens the door, and you get something out of that door. It's a system of the world that's basically almost like I don't know. It's kind of like a spiritual engineering. You know, you're optimizing the system that you kind of understand intelligibly. You I would say, when you're talking about American sensibilities and rationalizing it, I do think that there's one exception, one primary eh, people pray to God, obviously, for the health and well-being of their family and things like that. But, most people, I don't know about most, but, a lot of people articulate it in a way where they're not just saying that like, "Hey, God, like I'm giving you this prayer, so in return, my mom," they don't you're not supposed to, you're taught not to like couch in a transactional way. But there is something called, it's called prosperity gospel. I don't know if they call it that, but there is a strand of like kind of like Pentecostal spiritualist Christianity, evangelical Protestantism, where um, it gets pretty close. Where people pray, and their pastors like, well, if you pray hard enough, like it'll happen. It's kind of like the law of what is it?
Law of
Isn't there like
attraction?
some law of attraction? Yeah, there's it feels like the law of attraction when they talk to it, where they're like, again, they're still Christians, so they can't say that like, look, if you get an X amount of prayers, you're gonna get an X amount of money. But they come really close to saying that, your belief and your faith is going to translate into wealth and material, And I think it's just a strong instinct a lot of people have. They want it to work like that.
Yeah, the podcast is a terrible context for sharing a meme, but there's this meme that I love, which is an image of the Roman Colosseum with a group of people being set upon by lions. And the caption is, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, which is, I guess, the opposite of the prosperity gospel.
Correctly accurate. Yeah, yeah. Um, All right. Well, on that note, maybe we should move to something a little, less lighthearted, the Six Societies. And I would say I don't know that there would be any children or young people listening to this, but if so, parental discretion advised. I don't know what exact some of the details that we might talk about or whatever, but um, I guess we have these ideas. This is popular in the culture, and I think even Jared Diamond wrote a book about this or whatever. Is that modern society is very messed up in all sorts of ways because we aren't anymore in harmony with traditional ways of living or whatnot. And then if you look to these tribal or native groups, then you can find people who are more like in tuned with nature and human nature and the right way to do things or whatever, whether it's parenting or work life balance. I don't know, whatever. But and maybe there's some truth to that in some circumstances. But I guess one illustration of this Six Societies book is that's not always the case, right?
Yep, yeah. So this book was actually the one that led me to the Road Belong cargo book. So Six Societies is by an anthropologist at UCLA. He's since passed away. He has books from 1992, and he died, I think, sometime in the aughts. His name is Robert Edgerton. And so there was, in the 80s and 90s, and, still today, this kind of preconception among anthropologists that if a society is doing something, if they have some sort of practice or ritual or, social institution, it must be like basically a good idea. It must be basically looking for them, or they would have stopped doing it. So, and sometimes this is true, right? This is kind of Joe Henrich's shtick. And the secret of our success is, wow, look how smart cultural evolution is. It's led to people, develop these really elaborate ways of processing cassava that prevent them from getting chronic cyanide poisoning. It's led to these taboos against pregnant women eating particular kinds of seafood that, it turns out actually have dangerously high levels of whatever, gosh, it's just like biological evolution. This is, I'm exaggerating, but, it's just like biological evolution has designed the eyeball without anybody ever actually sitting down and figuring it out. Cultural evolution has developed all of these incredibly complex and successful institutions. And, some of the institutions of various societies work really well. And, nobody would ever have sat down and designed, the cassata processing from scratch. But there's also, things like the Navajo who have this incredibly pervasive fear of witchcraft and periodically would go into these social convulsions and expel or murder their neighbors under the belief that they were witches. They spent huge amounts of their time on magic, curing rituals that were supposed to prevent or heal the curses from the witches. And so the classic ethnography of the Navajo describes this as a really brilliant social institution that allows them to sort of achieve cultural social cohesion. But right? These are people who are spending enormous amounts of time, incredibly anxious, worried about a non-existent threat, occasionally murdering their neighbors. If nothing else, wasting time that they could be spending doing literally anything else productive or, delightful with their lives, trying to prevent or cure witchcraft. And if you try and, transfer this from strangers who live a very different lifestyle to you, to this academic department, which is, rife with politics and backstabbing, must be incredibly successful because they keep doing it. You immediately say that that's just silly. So Edgerton wrote this book basically just a list of examples of societies that do all kinds of really bizarre things that are obviously unpleasant, or scaling all the way up to no, they are about to go extinct. The most dramatic stories in the book all end with the colonial authorities of wherever these people are showing up and being like, no, you need to stop doing that right now, probably because in the cases where there was no outsider to show up and say, no, you need to stop doing that right now, the people just died out. I guess we can lead with the most, horrific example of there's this group in Melanesia who, just weren't having babies, right? They were going, literally culturally extinct because their fertility was so low. And there were various theories about what was going on. But eventually they concluded that what was happening was there was a cultural belief that strength came from male essence, which was communicated via sex. And so in order to make a new bride, fertile and strong and, able to bear many children, she needed to have sex with her new husband's entire extended family as frequently as possible. So the women all had chronic pelvic inflammatory disease and such horrific scarring that they were unable to become pregnant. So the population cratered, and eventually the Australian authorities showed up and said, no, you need to stop doing that. I don't know whether they are still around today, but, they were well on their way to dying out. And, there's stories of people who, practice just the most incredibly violent initiation rituals I'm not going to detail. If people want to read these really gross stuff, they can go find my book review. But, just doing just unbelievably horrific things to their sons and nephews and, the young men of their community, and when the colonial authorities showed up and said, no, you need to stop doing that, they're like, oh, thank God. We hated doing that, but we felt like we had to, right? There's the people who practice funerary cannibalism. You got to eat like a little bit of a dead person. And the ethnographer who was hanging out with them when the colonial authorities made them stop doing that, gets them on the record saying, I hated doing that. Sometimes I pretended not to, I would, feed it to dog and, and so you wonder, how did these things persist, right? You people, because people copy, people keep doing what they've been doing. And, and then there's lots of sort of less horrible, less dramatic things. There's societies where people are really, really careful to keep their children away from the evil sorcerers who might bewitch them, but not so careful about keeping their children away from the fire. The Maasai who are pastoralists in Kenya and Tanzania. They look at cows as sort of their central source of wealth. And cows have dung, and dung has flies. And so flies around your children's eyes is a sign of wealth. But it also, causes your children to go blind pretty frequently, right? This is not a culturally adaptive practice, but people do it anyway. So, I have kids and I spend a lot of time in sort of mom spaces where everybody wants to tell you how traditional societies, you never put down the baby. Traditional societies, you breastfeed until they're 9 years old. Traditional societies do this, that, and the other. And some traditional societies are really, really bad. It's not a place you want to live, right? The fact that people have done it for a long time is not actually a foolproof indication that it is a good idea or going to lead to human flourishing. And of course, I don't think very many people actually believe that, right? There's a long, proud tradition of Westerners pointing to barbarians, as you know, an example of some sort of virtue that we've lost. And it's not really about them, it's about us. And it's just a tool for us to say, I think this is good, but, there's some really weird stuff that people have done for a very long time, and that doesn't actually make it a good idea.
Yeah, let me just jump in real quickly because I know you have to go soon, Jane. When you're talking about these basically maladaptive traits that can persist, as opposed to the examples that Joe Henrik uses in his book, like maniac preparation. I think that makes it not toxic, whatever. Like it's complicated cultural adaptation. I think the way sometimes you need to think about this, or people need to think about it, is like you have this tendency of like imitation and conformity. And obviously, you can be adaptive on two different levels. So, if you're the one person in your tribe that doesn't do a stupid thing, they might think you're a witch and they're going to kill you. So that's not adaptive, right? So an analogy here in the biological realm would be sexual selection, where sometimes there's something called runaway sexual selection, Fisherian sexual selection, where the selection on a trait is coupled with a preference on the trait. And what ends up happening is individuals keep preferring that trait more and more. And as there are more and more individuals that prefer the trait, the strength of the preference increases. So you can have a situation where animals are barely functional now in the world, but they're still sexually attractive. And so you have these different forces that I think are interacting. And, ideally, the role of something like anthropology as a science would be to kind of tease this apart, because there are some things that are, clearly functional. Well, not actually, they're not clearly functional, and so that's the role of the investigator. And then there are other things which are not functional in, like, say, an ecological context, but they might be persistent for whatever reason within the local social context. And I think these are the things that we should try to tease apart. I mean, if we're rationalists, I mean, I think that there's some conservatives that would say you just leave, be a Burkean, just leave well enough alone, and Chesterton's fence and all that stuff, and be very, very careful. I think like an empirical conservative sensibility would say you should incrementally experiment and test and iterate, but the basic core functionality you leave alone, because probably it's around for a reason, or at least it's not harmful, right? What you're talking about, though, is in cases where some societies look like they're on the way to extinction. And that, too, is natural selection. I mean, I think that that's part of the story here, where, Joe Henrik is telling the story of positive selection, of adaptation. But, that only that doesn't occur just through selecting upon a favorite trait. It also occurs through eventual deselecting and like extinction of local populations. So I think what this is opening up is a more complex way to think about characteristics and traits that are heritable in some fashion, whether it's biological or cultural.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of traits that are cultural traits that are damaging or, bad. Yeah, things can be bad without being damaging, but that are not working well for people without actually leading them to, literal extinction. Those are some of the most dramatic and sort of surprising stories. But, there's lots of things that, the line is the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And so the cultural version of that could be, your society can stay dysfunctional longer than you can stay alive. There's sometimes if you're in a sort of situation of, like, just like with biological evolution, a situation of, intense competition. The fact that you're all chronically malnourished because you don't know how to farm very well is going to hurt you. But a lot of times you're just going to keep on being chronically malnourished. So you mentioned Chesterton's fence, which, I mean, can I just assume that your listeners know what Chesterton's fence is?
If not, you can Google it.
Chesterton is in a position of being able to use these kind of epistemological heuristics to defend the thing that he thinks is actually good, right? He's defending European Christendom. And he's saying, like we should probably, you people who are critics of this should assume that, your ancestors were not morons, but Chesterton, plenty of other places, is, a major critic of things that have been done since time immemorial. He writes all scathingly about Carthaginian infant sacrifice, and he, writes scathingly about the Aztecs. He's not he and Burke both sometimes get sort of caricatured as these kind of, that are not change anything. That's what conservatism means, guys. But, that's a tool, that's a rhetorical device that they're using to defend a thing that they think is, actually objectively good. And, if you're in a situation where the thing that is currently existing is bad, then this kind of lazy knee-jerk conservatism as opposition to change isn't going to work out. Well, right, it's exciting, Oh, the conservative thing to do in the Soviet Union is to, think the Soviet Union should keep going, like any definition of conservatism. That leads you to say the conservative thing to do is to think the Soviet Union should, keep sending people to the gulag is just useless. So, my big takeaway from both of these books and, a lot of the, my big sort of anthropology hobby horse is like there's such a range of human cultural diversity. People just do so many things that are so different from what our sort of Western educated, industrialized, assumptions are. And it's bracing to sort of realize like what we have is not determined in any sense. It could be very different. The possibility space is really, truly enormous. And you can't rely on these, well, have they done it for a long time, kinds of heuristics. Is it traditional to tell you if it's good or bad, right? You have to actually, think about whether things are, you have to think about ethics. You have to have a theory of sort of what, a philosophical anthropology as opposed to a cultural anthropology about, what is a human being? How should a human being live? What's that about? You have to engage with the much deeper questions. I mean, also, the stories are fascinating.
Wait, okay. Before you leave, I do want to address this a little bit because I think you can, look at different ways, use different lenses. So, for example, let's think about functional adaptive. Okay, so what type of, let's say marriage or marriage styles exist in human societies, and you look around. And if you're a blank slate, whatever, or Oneida community, Western utopianists, they think oh, you could do free love and all that. I mean, you could just look around. That's is not a stable state anywhere, but there are different stable states. One of the stable states is a preference for polygamy, even if most men don't do it. And another stable state, for example, in the West and some other societies, is basically monogamy, right? So you can say that both of these are stable states, right? And then you apply, your your values to which one would you prefer. Like Joe Henrich in his own work has arguments basically for monogamy because he thinks polygamous societies are just violent and violence is bad. Therefore, so I think you can have multiple, there's multiple filters, right? So I think you can use cultural anthropology as one filter, okay, some of these things are just absurd and maladaptive. And then of the adaptive ones, which ones align with our values? I think that's the way
right,
that I would
exactly, right. Yeah, exactly. You can't escape from the values question, right? You can when you're doing science, social science, to the degree that that's science. You can learn things about the world and you can accumulate information and you can say, okay, well, that's not a plausible thing that people could do. But of the set of plausible things that people could do, science is not going to give you the answer as to which one you should actually do. You have to engage in those values questions. Joe Henrich saying, well, violence is bad. I mean, that's a value judgment. I agree. I think he's right. But, there's no study you can do that's going to tell you, violence is bad.
I mean,
maybe he'll tell you many, many people think violence is bad.
BAP might draw a different conclusion, right? If you're a vitalist, maybe violence is good.
Yeah, exactly. So, all of the social science is absolutely fascinating, and I think incredibly fertile ground for the actual fundamental discussions about the values. But you can't escape from discussing ethics when you're trying to figure out what you should do. And I think many people who are interested in the social science aspects of human behavior think that it's a way of getting out from under, having to have philosophical conversations, and it's not. Sorry.
All right.
All right, should we let our pseudonymous guest go?
Yes. So the Substack is the Smiths. It does have a P at the front of it, even though it's pronounced Smith. So it's PSMITHS, I guess. It's a Substack, and it's very. I mean, we focused on a couple of thematically related books, but it really does run the gamut. I know you've done C.S. Lewis. I know you've done. I think your most recent review is a Latin textbook.
Yeah, I didn't like it. My husband writes about totally different stuff than I do. So
Right.
I always feel sort of sorry for people who come for, his opinions about like Xenophon and then like surprise, here's cannibalism.
Yeah.
But it's a fun kind of smorgasbord of our various
Well,
preoccupations, which overlap sometimes and veer wildly away from each other at other times.
yeah. Well, as my grandmother used to say, that's marriage for you. You show up for Xenophon, and surprise, there's cannibalism. So.
Hope you enjoyed the podcast so far. To listen to the rest of it, please go to conversation.substack.com.
Two minds met on a summer's eve, each with truths they long believed. Words flowed like a winding stream as hours passed in deep debate. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. It's not about who's wrong or right, but understanding others' light. In civil discourse we can find ties that gently bind. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. As dawn broke soft on dewy grass, they smiled and shook hands at last. Two souls enriched by reason talk, united in respect. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. This folk song captures the essence of a long, thoughtful discussion between between two public intellectuals. It emphasizes the power of patient listening, mutual respect, and the discovery of common ground. The gentle tone reflects the common understanding they reach after their debate. Would you like me to expand